Alrighty, so welcome back. That was a tremendous first set from Pedro Lopes, so thank you, Pedro. Yes,
I see
can.
him. I see him.
You see me? Okay.
Oh, okay.
All right. I'm going to exit and rejoin really quick. All right, I'm back. Can you hear me? Can you see me? Everything good?
I can.
All right, excellent. So I wanted to welcome you back and thank you for a tremendous set. It was really wonderful to see you work. My first time seeing you perform, so it was tremendous to be able to watch that. As far as questions go, I don't want to belabor, biographical things too much, but you could just describe a little bit how you arrived at working with the turntable with your current practice. Did you have a background in more formal percussion work before you were working with turntable, or did you come from a totally different angle?
Yeah, I think I come from a very different angle. I never studied percussion, and I'm definitely learning a lot by doing this kind of work, which is also a weird, interesting way to get into percussion because it has a lot of limitations, but it also has a lot of other stuff that you won't find so easily in most percussive instruments. But let me see. So I used to play when I was a kid, teenager. I used to play turntables, kind of like a turntablist, scratching back and forth, DJing hip hop gigs and things like that. And then I started getting very interested in jazz music, and from there on, getting interested in sort of the more freely improvised forms of jazz, and started to play with people, still with my approach of scratching. I have a lot of jazz records because I would sort of like take the solos and scratch and be the soloist. And I played with a lot of jazz musicians. They helped me a lot to figure out what I wanted to be musically. And for many years, I played kind of like that, being a soloist, very harmonic. And then slowly I started to realize, especially when I was forced to play solo, when I was forced to play with instruments that were atonal, I was realizing, oh, wait a second, these things are microphones and I can catch all sorts of really weird sounds. And then from there on, things just kind of happen and progress.
Absolutely. So, obviously with a non-traditional instrument such as the turntable, I'm sure you're constantly developing new techniques and exploring new, whether it's, found objects to throw on the turntable and play around with, or whether it's, media sources. Could you describe your practice of kind of stumbling upon new things to work with? I guess in both of those areas, whether it's, actually playable media that you're putting on the turntable or a percussive object. What's your practice like when you develop new techniques?
Yeah, I wonder. I've talked to a lot with friends about this. I think it's pretty much like a lot of other musicians that just different instrument and so different affordances. But I'll sometimes come with an idea and I'll try it. I will think something like, oh, I can get a really deep bass sound if I find some object with this resonating cavity or something, and I'll try it, and I'll be very surprised sometimes that didn't work. Sort of defies your understanding of the physics of these microphones. And then sometimes, while you're trying to figure out why that didn't work, you might stumble upon something else that you wouldn't expect, and you're very surprised. I think it ping-pongs between different sources of inspiration. I think sometimes play a little bit more with compositions and how do I get from one tonality to another. And in that case, I'll be listening to a lot of records and try to cue them in and trying to figure out in which speed they can exist to do that. And in other times, I'll just play for hours, just these percussive elements to try to find how they feel well, how they sound well, how they can go from one to the other really fast. That's always something that I'm always really interested. How can I transition between them sort of like in a way that it feels very natural to me, sort of at the speed of the ideas, because that's important. So yeah, I think my studio time kind of has two polarities, and they're very different. One is I play sets, much like what you guys just heard, and then the other one is I'll just be here for like hours, a little bit like a maniac, just trying something until it works or doesn't, and then
absolutely
I'll just try another one. That's a lot of fun, I have to say.
Absolutely. Something you said in there was really interesting to me. about tonality, because I think unlike other percussion instruments or practices with that, if you're sort of going back and forth sometimes or simultaneously using objects that kind of have no pitch relation or have a completely abstracted pitch relation, but then you have the ability also to throw on a record, whether that's something that is just kind of giving you obviously like a non-pitched something underneath everything, or whether it's like a record that has a tonal something going on that you then have to deal with and interact with. I think that's a really interesting problem to have to solve all the time. I know in the chat there were, we'll probably circle back to more audience questions a little bit later, but there was one that I also shared with some of the viewers, which was at the very beginning of that piece, there were 2 records that you had on the turntables as source media. I was wondering if you could describe what those records were. Were they records that you had found? Were they ones that you made for that purpose?
Those are good questions. This is one of them. The other one is I call the white record. This record is really interesting. It's really beautiful. It's from kind of the ESS of the experimental sound studio of Scandinavia, I would say. It's a place called Fylkingen. Maybe some of you have heard of Fylkingen.
Wow, fantastic.
And it's a venue. It's a performance venue, and they've been existing for so many years. And they put out this record, this record is weird because it's all locked grooves. So, which means that these are just 15-second tracks by 50 musicians or something like that.
Okay.
I think a few of the old timers at ESS are in this record too. But the grooves are locked, which means that they'll just endlessly play these 15 seconds. And that's a very interesting record for transforming into musical ideas. This is a record by Orhan Ambarki entitled A Final Kiss on Poisoned Cheeks. I really like the sort of the chord progression that he uses here. It's very deep, and I usually filter it, so it's kind of hard to recognize that it's his stuff. But I find it very beautiful. So these 2 are like typical examples of when I go for this tonality harmony approach, and I'm trying to find like a base where I want to develop an idea, which is exactly what you were kind of saying. Like, how do you mix those? Yeah.
Totally. I guess that brings up another question in my mind, which is, when you're using source material, there's kind of like a psychology there of using someone else's material and then being able to abstract that into new things. How does that work for you? How do you think about that? What's your approach to it, I guess?
I think because I started with hip hop, it was very easy for me to just rip off other people from a very early age. Because that's kind of what you do when you're sampling and you're making beats and everything. So for me, it was always a very natural thing to build on the music of others. But it becomes very interesting what you choose in terms of their music. Sometimes I'll choose like records from friends that I know so deeply that I can jump to like this millisecond and just play that particular part for it and jump out. I forgot to say the other record that was playing on this turntable here, which is a CD, is from Tumo, which is a Japanese band, 2 friends of mine.
Is that where the vibra slap was happening intermittently in there? Because I kept hearing a vibra slap somewhere in there.
I think that vibra slap was something that I looped and that I kind of composed a few days ago.
Okay, I
so
see.
That's actually my own thing.
All right, excellent. Yeah, I kept hearing that. I kept hearing it come in and being like, is that happening on that table, or is that coming from a different sound source? Anyway, continue. I'm sorry.
No. That's a good question. I forgot to say this little guy here actually has some of my compositions inside. And so playing with those sources kind of even has 2 modes. Sometimes I'm even playing with the energy of the people that I'm choosing, right? Literally like half of this stack here on this right side is like friends records. And I'll know as well, like, oh, my friend Pedro Souza, he has these records where he's very violent on saxophone. And I sometimes use that. I'll play it very slowly, so it's hard for you to tell the timbre of a saxophone. But I know the energy is kind of there. So there's choices that are very deliberate, like musicians that I've never met, Oren, but I love his music. But there are others that are almost like physicality choices. I'll be like, here's a violent passage. Let me use that.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I want to maybe take a little bit of a left turn real quick and ask you about your work with human-computer interaction, the the human computer integration lab, your work with those studies, if you wanted to describe your work there at all.
Yeah, I can talk about that.
Sure.
That's very unrelated to my music, which is very interesting because I do get that occasional question of like, do these things intertwine? And for some reason, I don't know exactly why not. They don't. But they have similar styles. Like both my music and my work in human computer interaction, which by the way is the field that deals with interfaces, right? How do we, design the interface that we're using right now on Skype to talk better and to obstruct our communication the least as possible, which is the ideal interface. Or even these interfaces, the very physical kind of interfaces. Should we put the button here, there? Should it provide force when I move or not? Those sorts of questions. But what is very similar between going to the lab and doing my research and being here is that here I also feel like, as we were talking before, I also feel kind of like I'm doing my own research in that space of, oh, let me test these little objects. Here's the hypothesis. Maybe this is going to work. Oh, it turns out it doesn't work. Why doesn't it work? And I get very enamored with that too, trying to understand the turntable as much as I can. I've done a couple of projects that were just about me and kind of understanding the turntable. For a while, one of the last projects I did was to kind of try to play the turntable without electricity. And so just to understand like how much of this music that I play has to do with the fact that I can plug into the wall, right? And kind of get energy. And turns out it's like 95% of it. So I did a residency where I played only with gramophones. For those that maybe still remember, like the turntable you got to crank, and he has a needle and a cone, and it's all acoustic. And it was very interesting, but I can tell you it was horrible and very hard too, because it's just all this stuff has to do with energy being pumped into the system, and I can do all these things and amplify things that are really crazy. So I play with the sound of my nails and my fingers a lot. You couldn't do that another way. But I digress from your question about the study of interfaces. But that's kind of how I see it. Here's more like the applied, and when I go to the lab, I'm more, I guess, on the concepts of interfaces and building them and everything. Yeah.
Sure. I think there is though a common thread there in trying to translate, the impetus that you're feeling or want to express, and being able to input that into any kind of system. There was a question from Ken, I believe, about, I think this is a sort of technical question about your setup, but is all of the sound coming from the needles on the turntables? And if not, could you describe the other sound sources that are kind of looped in with things?
So it is, today it's a little bit of an unusual setup because usually I only play with two turntables because, you got to carry stuff to the ESS or to another show and you got to make choices. And because I'm at home, I can play with everything, which is always interesting but a little distracting too. So I'm playing with a pedal that can make loops for me, so I can loop the sound only of these two. And I'm playing with a digital turntable here. It's just a CD player, but it spins and has force, which is very important for me. And so that's all I have. I have these two turntables, and I have this pedal board that can loop, and I have another turntable there, but that one cannot be looped.
Fantastic.
But if you ever see me live, I'll usually not even have the pedal board because you got to cut somewhere, and I'll just take the turntables.
Totally. There's always that factor to consider in making those musical choices.
Sometimes only even one, which is those are the hardest.
As a guitar player, that it affects me maybe less than percussionists or other instruments, but definitely
you got to think about the amps,
physically lifting something is always a challenge, I guess, to some extent. I want to remind folks who may be just tuning in that if you have any questions that you would like to ask Pedro, feel free to throw them in the chat, and we will try to field as many as we can. Speaking of which, we have one from Arash that says, just asking, who are some of your musical influences that impacted the development of your style?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. Hey, Arash. I think there's different sort of types of influences that impact the style. I think the most groundwork and most important influences are the people that you actually play music with, right? So, I could make a huge list here of people, especially in Lisbon, Portugal, where I'm from, like Gabriel, Pedro, and Bruno, and many others, because those people sort of define me, and we were defining each other's musicality at the same time. We had bands together, all sorts of different ensembles and so forth. But when it comes to like the aesthetic on the turntables, I think I either draw a lot of inspiration from very noisy turntablists like Otomo Yoshihide. It's like one of my favorites. And or Martin Tétrault, he's a Quebecois turntablist who always blows my mind. Or even from some of the hip hop people that are more on the scratch front, like Kid Koala, who I think is very musical in his way of approaching scratch. And then, of course, because of the percussion thing, I'm always looking for inspiration in that front too. And so I listen to like endless amounts of percussion and drumming. And one of the people that really influenced me, and I never know how to say his name properly, but is Lee Kwan Lee. He's a Vietnamese percussionist who I just think is super, super, super inspirational. I had the luck of hearing him play when I was still fairly young and still developing the turntables in an early stage. And that concert like changed my mind and my life kind of. I got out of it and I was like, somehow I need to create the sound of a big timpani thing in my turntable. I don't know how, but I tried it. First I tried it with effects and then I realized I could just put drums on it.
Fantastic. So if there are any other questions, definitely try to get them in the chat now before we move on to the second set. But I think my last question is just kind of more a question about the current time that we're in. Obviously, over the last 2 months, being able to perform music in spaces with other human beings is kind of taken away from us, and it's a really strange thing to adjust to. I guess my question for you is, how have you been adjusting to that? How has your work changed over the last 2 months? And if you just want to talk about where you're at right now.
Yeah, this was a very interesting experience for me because somehow it's kind of in many ways it's a phenomenal, interesting piece to be able to play at home in your studio, right? So all your stuff is here, and you can make it very cozy. I'm sitting on my record shelves, and I usually don't have all the records and all that. But at the same time, it's also sort of brought back to me the very reason why we go to ESS and play with others and see others, in the same space and everything. But it's an interesting conflict that I am in my work is the same thing, where we're sort of trying to piece together, can we move from this situation by learning a few interesting lessons? So one that is very beautiful is that I'm pretty sure there's someone in the stream right now watching this that isn't from Chicago, and they wouldn't be able to come to ESS, up north and sit with the two of us and talk about it. And now they have access to that. So in terms of accessibility, this is a very special time. And I think I kind of would hope that we can learn from here how to make events more accessible and share things and play with people from all over the world and things like that. But like you said, there's something special about sitting in the same room. Even the fact that I know that what you're hearing is what I'm hearing is already really good, musically speaking. But even just in terms of learning from others, talking to others, and just being together. Yeah.
Absolutely.
I'm adjusting. Yeah.
hopefully, when it is safer to be in larger groups in the same room, we can still fuse the aspect of making it accessible to folks all over the place.
Beautiful. And I think ESS has been, you all have been doing a really good job with the quarantine concerts. Yeah. So, I wish this idea can permeate into some hybrid model.
Absolutely. I think everyone's stepping up their live stream game is going to help everything, even when it's not necessary anymore. All right. So unless there are any more questions, I don't see any right now in my feed here. I would like to cut Pedro loose to perform a second piece here. So once again, Pedro Lopes.
Thank you. I'll switch things around, start the stream. See you in a second.